We're May 1st, and we're going to do another episode of Stand Tall, but this time we're going to start out with a reading from the Daily Stoic by Brian Holiday and Stephen Hanselman. The theme for May is the discipline of action, or right action. May 1st, make character your loudest statement. For philosophy doesn't consist in outward display, but in taking heed to what is needed and being mindful of it. Musonius Rufus Lectures 16.75.15 to 16. The monk dresses in his robes, a priest puts on his collar, a banker wears an expensive suit and carries a briefcase. A Stoic has no uniform and resembles no stereotype. They are not identifiable by look or sight or by sound. The only way to recognize them by their character. Your character is what you have at the end of the day, right? Your word, right? So, with the correct action, always make sure to do what is in line with your character. Man, that is like the third episode in a row I've sneezed. That's crazy. All right, so now we're going to go over to the Art of War. We have just started in the chapter on terrain. So we talked about ground, which can be freely traversed by both sides, called being accessible. With regard to ground of this nature, be before the enemy and occupying the raised and sunny spots, and carefully guard your line of supplies. Then you will be able to fight with advantage. Verse 4. Ground which can be abandoned but is hard to reoccupy is called entangling. From a position of this sort, if the enemy is unprepared, you may sally forth and defeat him. But if the enemy is prepared for your coming and you fail to defeat him, then return being impossible, disaster will ensue. And so this is kind of like this like entangling ground that we're talking about with your character. It's kind of like you have all of this stuff and all of these things in life kind of can give you an entangling ground. You sort of can't back out. And a lot of things when you show your character, you can't back out from, right? If you show bad character, bad faith, a lot of times, if you've ever read the book, The Speed of Trust, it's like a bank account. Trust is like a bank account. Like it builds up a little bit over time, but like one bad thing to break that trust is like a massive withdrawal from that bank account, and it makes it that much harder to build back up. All right, so we like to go over to an alternate translation just to see what we can glean, and we know that he's talking about a bunch of different kinds. They group them all together, and so again, Li Quan saying these are the configurations of terrain. Generals who do not know them lose. And Mei Yaochen says the form of land is the basis on which the military is aided and victory is established, so it must be measured. So you have to really take into account the terrain. But again, we'll be moving on in the subsequent episodes a little bit more, but we'll go ahead and read from the alternate translation, the first verse in chapter 10. Some terrain is easily passable, Master Sun says. In some you get hung up, some makes for a standoff, some is narrow, some is steep, some is wide open. When both sides can come and go, the terrain is said to be easily passable. When the terrain is easily passable, take up your position first, choosing the high and sunny side, convenient to supply routes for advantage in battle. When you can go but have a hard time getting back, you are said to be hung up. On this type of terrain, if the opponent is unprepared, you will prevail if you go forth. If the enemy is prepared, if you go forth and do not prevail, you will have a hard time getting it back to your disadvantage. When it is disadvantageous for either side to go forth, it is called standoff terrain. On standoff terrain, even though the opponent offers you an advantage, you do not go for it. You withdraw, reducing the enemy half out, and then you attack to your advantage. Okay, so standoff terrain is interesting because both sides are able to attack, but whoever attacks first is the one at the disadvantage. On narrow terrain, if you were there first, you should fill it up to await the opponent. If the opponent is there first, do not pursue if the opponent fills the narrows. Pursue if the opponent does not fill the narrows. On steep terrain, if you are there first, you should occupy the high and sunny side to await the opponent. If the opponent is there first, withdraw from there and do not pursue. On wide open terrain, the force of momentum is equalized, and it is hard to make a challenge, disadvantageous to fight. Understanding these 6 kinds of terrains is the highest responsibility of the general, and it is imperative to examine them. So again, all of the different situations, right? Like the high terrain, if someone's already occupying that position, this could be as like your boss, your manager, or somebody else who has some authority. And then standoff terrain is going to be any kind of terrain where there may not be an advantage going forward. So it's always like analyzing your terrain to make the best decision. Because if you're not aware of what terrain you're in, but the enemy is, then they have the advantage.